Subscribe to LearnCab and hit the bell icon to get notified.
Hello everyone, thanks for joining in. Students, before we move on, I want to understand how many of you think that law is a difficult subject. And why is it difficult? Is it because of the terminologies or sections, or is it just the phobia? It's all in your head. Okay? Worry not. Today we have CA Anushri Agrawal with us. Anushri Agarwal is a chartered accountant and a company secretary. She has been a rank holder AIR 14th, 5th and 4th in all three levels of CS course. After working for a brief period in PwC's direct tax team, she began teaching law and income tax to CS students in Chennai. It's been 5+ years now since she started teaching and is also associated with academies across Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, and Chhattisgarh. With several exemption scorers and rank holders, results of her students speak for themselves. Today, ma'am will be guiding you all on how to approach the law subject, how to read and score well. I'm sure by end of the session you will all find the subject interesting rather than fearing it. Now I request ma'am to take over and guide the students on strategy to clear business law paper with some great marks.
Okay, come on guys. So let's begin the session. I am glad to be here with you all today to discuss the November 2020 question paper with you all. It's going to be a very learning, it's going to be a session which is going to be full of learning. It's going to be a lot of concepts, a lot of revision of a lot of concepts which you've done already. The November 2020 question paper is one of the, a very properly planned question paper wherein the examiner has been very careful in taking correct amount of questions from each chapter. So if we are going to revise this paper, if we are going to discuss this paper, or like how Rajeshri said, if we are going to decode this paper, then a lot of revision gets done. Alright, so now in this session, I will be discussing with you all just part A of your second paper. I will be discussing just the 60 marks of your business laws question paper. Alright, now to make this session very effective, what I want all of you to do is, I want you all to participate as much as possible in the chat box. Okay, this is a live webinar. It's not a recorded one. So you make use of the fact that it is live. As much as interaction as I have with you all, the better it's going to be for you and for me. Okay, so let's make full use of the chat box. Okay, keep sending your questions, keep answering my questions. A proper interaction like how you would have answered my questions had we been sitting face to face in a classroom. Okay, so on that note, let's begin the discussion. Coming to the very first question, your compulsory question. In the first question, the compulsory question, there were totally 3 questions and all the 3 questions were for 4 marks each. I am assuming all of you are aware of the question paper pattern, right? For your CA Foundation Business Laws paper, it will be an entirely descriptive paper, no MCQs, alright? There will be totally 6 questions. Out of these 6 questions, the first question will be compulsory. Okay? Out of the balance 5 questions, you are given a choice. You can attempt any 4. Alright? So totally you will be answering 5 questions. The first compulsory question and 4 out of the remaining 5. Okay? And each question will be for totally 12 marks. Each question will be totally for 12 marks. In each question, there will be sub-questions. There will be 1 2-mark question, 1 4-mark question, 1 6 marks question. It depends. But each question totally will be for 12 marks. So that is how your first part A of your second paper gets tested for 60 marks. Okay. So be aware of this basic question paper pattern. And I'm assuming that all of you who are attending this session today, all of you all are either mostly, I think, students who will be writing in these Jan exams, and maybe some of you writing in the May exam. But if you're attending this session, then obviously it would be because you're already done learning the paper, you're already done learning the subject, and you're here just to, discuss the November 2020 question paper. Because if you're going to be here, with absolutely no idea of the subject, then I really don't know if you would be able to follow this session properly. It's majorly for those students, the target is majorly those students who have already studied the paper and who want to know what would be the right answers for the November 2020 exam. Alright, and maybe some November 2020 students might also be here who might want to, pre-decide what will be their total in that paper. Alright, now one student has asked for the question paper pattern. Once again, it's very simple. Entirely descriptive paper, absolutely no MCQs in your business laws part. You will be having totally 6 questions. The first question is going to be a compulsory question. Out of the balance 5 questions, you are allowed to pick any 4. So you will be writing totally 5 questions, the first compulsory question and 4 out of the remaining 5. So that's how you will be writing 5 questions, and each question will carry 12 marks. So you will total up to 60 marks. Alright, okay. And your business laws paper is generally very, very unpopular for being too lengthy. Students are not really able to complete the entire paper in 3 hours. You've got to build your writing speed. Oh wow, even Aditya has asked the same question while I was talking about this. Aditya, what we'll do is that we'll discuss about this in detail after we finish the question paper discussion, alright? In case I forget, please remind me about this, Aditya. At the end of the session, we'll discuss how to complete the paper quickly in 3 hours. Alright, fine. Now listen to me. Let's focus on the question paper now. Let's take the first question. Let's read what the question says first. We will carefully read the question. Everybody pay full attention on the question. Mr. X, a businessman, has been fighting a long-drawn litigation with Mr. Y, an industrialist. So X and Y, they are having a case going on. To support his legal campaign, he enlists the services of Mr. C, a judicial officer, stating that the amount of rupees 10 lakhs would be paid to him if he does not take up the brief of Mr. Y. Mr. C agrees, but at the end of the litigation, Mr. X refuses to pay to Mr. C. Decide whether Mr. C can recover the amount promised by Mr. X under the provisions of the Indian Contract Act 1872. Now, what do we do about this? First of all, understand the question. X and Y, these two people, they are having a case going on against each other. What X does is that very smartly, he comes to this Mr. C. Who is Mr. C? Mr. C is a judicial officer. Judicial officer means what? Nothing but Mr. C is a judge. He is some judicial officer. Basically, he's, let's say, somewhat similar to the post of a judge. Okay. So, X comes to Mr. C and says, listen, don't take up the brief of Mr. Y. I will give you 10 lakh rupees, right? I'll give you 10 lakh rupees for this. Don't pass the decision in Y's favor. Pass the decision in my favor. What has X done? X has indirectly promised a bribe to C. C, a judicial officer. C, who is a judge. So, Mr. C agrees to it. He says, okay, I won't pass the decision in Y's favor. Case gets over. And now C comes to X and asks for 10 lakh rupees. X says April Fool. X refuses to give that 10 lakh rupees to C. Now C is asking you, can he recover the amount promised by Mr. X under the provisions of Indian Contract Act 1872? This question was asked for 4 marks in the examination. Now listen to me. What would your answer to this question be? In the answer to this question, you are supposed to talk about 3 concepts, okay? Concept number 1, section 10. Section 10 tells you about what are the essential elements of a valid contract. For example, there must be free consent, Parties must be competent, there must be lawful consideration, there must be lawful object, there must be a valid offer, valid acceptance, at least two parties. All these points are written in section 10. It contains a list of essential elements, right? I think one of the last few points of section 10, it will be written that the contract should not be one which is expressly declared to be void. What does the last point say? The last point says the contract should not be something which is expressly declared to be void, which means the contract, if it has to be a valid contract, it should not be something which is declared as void by the act itself. Okay. Now the Contract Act gives you a list of void agreements. One of them is an agreement in restraint of legal proceedings. An agreement in restraint of legal proceedings. Listen to me very carefully. In this entire example, if you see, what exactly is X trying to do? X is trying to do something so that Y is not able to take the benefits of the legal system of a country. You agree with me? X is trying to do something so that Y is not able to take the benefits of a country's legal system. This agreement is in restraint of legal proceedings. It is not allowing Y to enforce his legal rights. We are trying to take away Y's legal rights through the agreement between X and C. So this agreement between X and C, number one, it is in restraint of legal proceedings. In restraint of legal proceedings means we are not letting Y enforce his legal rights. Hence it becomes void. Any agreement in restraint of legal proceedings, section 28 of the Act says it is void. Okay. Then if you look at another perspective, you also have agreements that are opposed to public policy. Even agreements that are opposed to public policy are void ab initio. And the list of agreements again opposed to public policy, that list contains one of the points, interference with the course of justice. For example, if you're going to bribe the judge, or if you're going to bribe one of the witnesses of the case, then you will put it under the category interference with the course of justice. You are not allowing the judge, the court, to go according to their own process. You are trying to interfere, you are trying to tweak the process in your favor. If you do this, it will be against public policy. Okay, so in this case over here, you will write number one about section 10. You will say how section 10 gives the list of essential elements of a valid contract, one of which is that the agreement should not be expressly declared to be void. Then you will write that an agreement which is in restraint of legal proceedings is void ab initio, it is invalid. And in this example over here, this agreement between X and C is in restraint of legal proceedings because Y's legal rights are not being allowed. Y's legal rights are being taken away. Hence, this agreement is in restraint of legal proceedings, hence it will be void. Then you will also write that this case is also against public policy because any agreement which interferes with the course of justice, for example, any agreement to bribe a judicial officer or to bribe a witness is against public policy and even that is void. You understood the answer, guys? Are we all clear with the first question? Can I go to the second question? Yes? First question all clear? Come on, quickly give me a response. I'll go to the second question now. Coming to 1B. What does the second question say? Second question was an extremely simple question, a company law-based question. ABC Limited has allotted equity shares with voting rights to XYZ Limited worth 15 crores and issued non-convertible debentures worth 40 crores during financial year 1920. This first sentence is the most important sentence of this question. We'll have to understand this properly. In ABC Limited, if you see who is the shareholder, you will realize that XYZ Limited is holding shares worth 15 crores in ABC Limited, which means XYZ Limited is a shareholder of ABC Limited. Okay. And this XYZ Limited is also a debenture holder of ABC Limited. The company is holding non-convertible debentures worth 40 crores. Okay. Now listen to me. After that, total paid up equity share capital of the company is 100 crores and non-convertible debenture stands at 120 crores. So what are they trying to say over here? The total share capital of the company is 100 crores. Out of this 100 crores, 15 crores is held by our XYZ Limited. Okay. The total non-convertible debentures of ABC Limited is 120 crore. Out of this, 40 crores is held by XYZ Limited. So XYZ Limited is basically both a shareholder and debenture holder of the company. Okay, let's proceed. Define the meaning of associate company and comment on whether ABC Limited and XYZ Limited would be called associate company as per the provisions of Companies Act 2013. In this question, they have asked us two questions. Number one, they're asking us to define associate company, a pure theory question. Then they're also asking us to comment whether ABC Limited and XYZ Limited will be called associate company or not. So two questions they have asked us. Number one, define associate company. That is a very simple question. If you've learned the theory, you will easily be able to handle the question. What will you write? You will write an associate company is a company in which another company has significant influence. This word significant influence becomes one of your keywords. Okay? You'll have to write significant influence in the answer. Associate company is a company in which another company has significant influence. Then you'll have to explain what is significant influence. Significant influence means control over at least 20% of the voting power of the company or control over business decisions of the company. And it includes even joint venture. So first you will give the definition of associate company. What is significant influence? Don't forget to write control over at least 20% of the voting power or control over business decisions of the company. And also includes a joint venture. Okay, this will be the answer to your first question. Now they are asking us, between ABC and XYZ Limited, is the associate company relationship existing? What will your answer be? See, listen to me. What is significant influence? 20% voting power. Out of 100 crores total capital, XYZ has only 15 crores, which means XYZ has only 15%. That 15% is less than 20%, hence your answer will be that it is not an associate. How much debentures of the company XYZ Limited is holding is irrelevant. What is relevant? Relevant only two things. How much equity share XYZ Limited is holding, how much preference share XYZ Limited is holding. I will consider just these two. How much debentures, what is the value of debentures that XYZ Limited is holding, I won't even bother. So equity plus preference is only 15%, which does not reach 20%. Hence, ABC is not an associate of XYZ Limited. Is this question clear? Such a simple question asked for 4 marks. Just testing whether you are aware of the 20% number or not. Tell me guys, are we clear with this question? Can I go to the next one? Yes? Any questions about the first two? See, how to present the answer in the examination, we've already learnt about that in the earlier webinar which we conducted. Those of you who failed to watch that webinar, those of you who weren't able to attend that webinar, you can see the video, it's already uploaded on the LearnCab's YouTube channel. Okay, so how to present answers we've already seen. In this session, we are just discussing the question paper and seeing what would be the right answer and what would be the wrong answer and some keywords here and there. I've already told you how important it is for you to Write keywords in the examination. Remember, those of you who attended the last webinar, we learnt about that over there. We learnt about the importance of keywords in the last webinar. So please make sure you also have a look on the recording of the last webinar, which is already there in the YouTube channel, in case you did not attend the webinar. Because this session alone, standalone, without being aware of what we discussed over there, will be incomplete. Okay, so make sure you have a look at that also. Okay, now coming to the third question. The third question was a pure theoretical question, a pure descriptive question. Write any 4 exceptions to the doctrine of caveat emptor as per the Sale of Goods Act 1930. This was asked for 4 marks. Now listen to me. Your law paper, your second paper, part A, is not going to be fully case study based. It's also not going to be fully direct questions like this. It's going to be a mixture, and a very good mixture, mostly half-half. Okay, so don't just focus on case study based questions, even focus on these straightforward questions. It will be a proper mixture of both case study questions and straightforward questions. Okay, now what are they asking us over here? 4 exceptions to the doctrine of caveat emptor. Immediately don't start writing the 4 exceptions. Okay, you're writing a professional exam. So first start with talking about what is this doctrine of caveat emptor. The doctrine of caveat emptor means let the buyer be aware. Buyer, when he is buying goods, he is supposed to make reasonable inquiries and satisfy himself that the goods that he is purchasing will be fit for the purpose for which he is purchasing. Later, if the goods turn out to be defective or if the goods turn out to be unfit, then the buyer cannot blame the seller. So first write what is the doctrine of caveat emptor and then write down the exceptions. They have asked for 4 exceptions, so write just 4. I have brought over here 6 exceptions to discuss with you all. You can write any 4 out of these 6. The first exception is fitness as to quality or use. What does this exception say? Very simple. In case the buyer informs the seller what is the purpose for which he wants to buy the goods, and if he is going to rely on the seller, that seller, you choose and you give me whichever goods will be perfect for my purpose, and seller is somebody who is ordinarily dealing in such goods, in such cases, if the goods later on turn to be unfit, then you can blame the seller. Okay, see, basically caveat emptor puts responsibility on the buyer. Caveat emptor tells a buyer, you be careful, later on don't blame the seller. In these exceptional cases, we will put responsibility on the seller. We will protect the buyer. What is the first exception? Fitness as to quality or use. It has totally 3 conditions. Condition number 1, the buyer should inform the seller the purpose why he wants the goods. Condition number 2, he must rely on the seller for the choice of goods. And number 3, who is the seller? The seller is somebody who is ordinarily dealing in those goods. If all the 3 conditions get fulfilled, then the goods should be fit for that purpose. If the goods turn out to be unfit, seller is responsible. Okay, here don't forget to give the example of priest versus last. Have you heard of this case? Priest versus last. What happened in this case? In this case, a particular customer, the buyer, went to a chemist shop, went to a medical shop and asked for a bottle, a hot water bottle wherein he can store hot water. Okay, so this chemist gave him the bottle. The buyer trusted the chemist. The buyer told the chemist, you pick and tell me whichever bottle will be fit for my purpose. He relied on him, and the seller is somebody who ordinarily deals with these kind of goods. But at home, as soon as he put hot water into this bottle burst. So basically this bottle was unfit to be used as a hot water bottle, and hence they could blame the seller. Okay, so this is about the first point. Now coming to the second point. Goods purchased under a brand name. when you purchase goods under a brand name, no, this you cannot write about this because this is an exception to this point. So ignore this. Come to the next point. Goods sold by description. If the seller is selling goods to you by description, then the goods should match the description. For example, if the seller is saying that I am going to sell imported chocolates to you, what is the description he is giving you? He is giving you the description as they are imported chocolates. So the chocolates should match this description. If the goods don't match the description, you can hold the seller responsible. Then sale by sample. If a sample was shown to the buyer, then the goods, the final goods, the bulk of the goods should match the sample. If they don't match the sample, again you can hold the seller responsible. Then if the sale was made by sample and description, the final goods should match the sample also, should match the description also. And lastly, if the seller is hiding a defect in such a way that it is impossible for the buyer to have identified the defect, then in such cases you can't hold the buyer responsible. The buyer put in reasonable enquiries, but he still wasn't able to find out that the goods are defective because the seller had put in effort to hide the defect. In such cases also, I will hold the seller responsible. Okay, so you can write any 4 exceptions out of these. Very simple question this was. You will first have to explain what is caveat emptor, right? That buyer beware and buyer is responsible. Buyer cannot hold the seller responsible if the goods are unfit. Then in these exceptional cases, the seller can be held responsible. Fitness as to quality or use. Goods should be fit for the purpose that I told the seller. Then goods sold by description, sale by sample and description, and the seller put in effort and hid the defects from the goods. So that even if you put in reasonable enquiries, you will not be able to, find out that the goods are defective. Okay. Now Aditya has asked a question in the chat box, a very relevant question, Aditya. He is saying, ma'am, if it is said that write any 4 cases, then is it compulsory to write each point in detail? Yes, Aditya, very much. You cannot simply give the headings. If you are simply going to give headings, you won't get marks. All that worked in school but will not work anymore because you are in a professional course right now. So if you're just going to write the heading, you're not going to get the marks. You will have to write at least some basic description about each point. Only then will you get the marks. And don't think examiner will just read the heading and he won't read what is written inside. He will read. He will give you marks on the basis of what you write under each point. You understand, Aditya? So make sure you don't write just the headings. Please also explain. And here you might think, oh, for just 4 marks you have to write so much. Yes, you will have to. You will have to, for a 4 marks question, the average size of the answer. I'm saying it's an average size of the answer. It might vary from question to question. But on an average, a 4-mark question should come for at least half a page. Okay? Only then will you be able to fetch enough marks for this question. This is about the first question. The first question, all the 3 parts, are we clear? Can I go to the second question, guys? Now coming to the next question, the second question. Let's read the question. Second question again is a pure descriptive question. Define misrepresentation and fraud. Explain the difference between fraud and misrepresentation as per the Indian Contract Act 1872. A pure theory question. You will have to first define, totally 3 questions are involved over here. You will have to first define what is misrepresentation. Positive assertion not warranted by information of the person making it, which is not true though he believes it to be true. Breach of duty without any intention to deceive. Causing innocently a party to an agreement to make a mistake. Basically, first write the definition of misrepresentation. Then write down the definition of fraud. Suggesting an untrue fact, knowing it to be untrue, actively concealing facts, promising without any intention of performing any other deceiving act. Write the definition of fraud. This will be the second question. Then differences between fraud and misrepresentation. This is a pure theory question. I'm not going too much in detail for this question. It's a 7 marks question. Alright. Define misrepresentation. When you define misrepresentation, make sure you use the words without any intention to deceive. This without any intention to deceive, innocently, all these become your keywords. They should be there in your answer. See, I'm going a little out of topic, but there is this one thing which I want to tell you all. You might be wondering that why do I keep stressing so much on keywords? See, you can write in your own words in the exam, okay? But keywords have to be used. Whether your answer is grammatically correct or not, nobody cares. But then what is the kind of words you are using, that is important. I will tell you one small example, okay? I happened to see the key, the answer key for the accounts question paper. Okay, for CA intermediate accounts question paper, I happened to see the answer key. And trust me, the answer key which is sent to the examiner for paper correction is way different from the suggested answers which institute puts up in the website. Okay, so I'm talking about two different documents, suggested answers and answer key. I'm talking about the answer key over here. Understand that they are different. In this answer key, you know what was written? It was written that, see, after you do your balance sheet, you know, your equities and liabilities and assets, after you finish your entire balance sheet, you write notes to accounts. In the notes to accounts, you will give one note on share capital, you will give one note on creditors and so on. You know what was written in the answer key? That instead of notes to accounts, okay, if the student writes the heading as working note, instead of notes to account, if the student writes working note, then don't even see what is written under share capital, under creditors and all. Don't give marks at all. Just the heading is wrong. Instead of notes to accounts, student has written working note. Entire calculation is correct, but still no marks. Why? Because it is important that you write the word notes to accounts. They are called notes to accounts and they are not called working notes. Are you able to understand the significance of keywords? Right? So some important words have to be there in your answer paper. For example, if you're writing about misrepresentation, you have to write these words without any intention to deceive, innocently. All these become your keywords. This is how you build a good total for yourself. Okay? Show the examiner that you have studied. You get it? So this is about misrepresentation. Under fraud, you will have to write with intent to deceive. There is an intention to cheat the other party in fraud. Okay? So first definition of misrepresentation, then definition of fraud, and then they've asked the differences. Under differences, what and all will you write? You will say, define what is fraud, you will define what is misrepresentation. Then you will say that in a fraud, there is an intention to deceive the other party. But in misrepresentation, there is no intention to deceive the other party. It is an innocent misstatement of facts. Then you will say under fraud that the aggrieved party can also claim damages. In misrepresentation, you cannot claim any damages. So put down the differences between fraud and misrepresentation. Total question was asked for 7 marks. Okay? Entire 7 marks about fraud and misrepresentation. If you've learned theory properly, very easily you will be able to handle this question. Alright, fine. Now coming to the next question which Sumesh has asked us in the chat box. Is it necessary to mention section number for all the questions? No, Sumesh, it is not necessary. You need not mention the section number. If you are able to remember the section number, then you write the section number. But if you're not able to remember the section number, you don't have to put any extra effort to memorize section numbers, at least for your CA foundation level, not required. Okay? Don't put down wrong section numbers, but whatever happens, don't put down wrong section numbers. No section number is better than wrong section number. Got it, Sumesh? Yes. Is everybody clear with the second question part A? Can I go to the second part of this question? So Tanishka, yes, basis of difference is important. It's better to write it, okay? Because it will be easier for you also to write the answer. It will be easier for the examiner also to correct your answer. Make your answer paper easy for the examiner. Don't make him feel it's such a headache to correct your paper. Make it easy, simplify things for the examiner. I always say write your answer paper as if you are teaching the examiner, as if he knows nothing. Okay, so give him the basis of difference. It's always better. It's always better because that's a standard format. Alright, so make sure you put in the basis of difference. Alright, can I go to the second question, guys? Are you all clear with this one? Okay, let's go to the B division, the second division of the second question. Even this was purely a theoretical question, a pure descriptive question. So which means the second question was fully pure theory. Part A also we saw full theory, part B also theory. This part B question was from the LLP Act. In the entire question paper, there was only one question from the LLP Act, which is this one. And it was asked for 5 marks, a very simple question. What are the circumstances under which LLP may be wound up by the tribunal under LLP Act? We all know that an LLP may be wound up either voluntarily, partners may decide and voluntarily it may get wound up, or it may be wound up by the tribunal. So they're asking us what are the cases in which the LLP will be wound up by the tribunal. Now this question, the fraud and misrepresentation question, the caveat emptor question, if you notice all these theory questions, they all belong to the category which every student would have definitely studied, because every faculty will tell you that these are important questions, these are important chapters. If you've noticed till now, all the descriptive questions, all the straightforward questions which we have seen, none of them till now belongs to a category which a student might want to skip. All these questions student will definitely study. So even this is one such question. What are the situations in which LLP will be wound up by the tribunal? Quickly I'll tell you there are totally 6 cases. Case number 1, if the LLP itself decides that I want to get wound up by the tribunal, then the tribunal will wind up that LLP. Number 2, if in the LLP minimum number of partners is 2. Something happens, one of the partner dies or one of the partner leaves. So we are left with only one partner, isn't it? But minimum is 2 partners. In such cases, we will give this LLP 6 months time. We will give the LLP 6 months time to increase the number of partners to 2. They have only one single partner right now, but minimum is 2. So we will give the LLP 6 months time to increase this number of members to 2. Okay. Even in this 6 months, if LLP is not able to increase the number of members to 2, and if it is still carrying on business even after 6 months with this less number of members, then tribunal will wind up this LLP. Okay, this is the second case. In the third case, what has happened is that the LLP is not filing the statement of accounts. LLP is not filing the solvency return, the annual return for 5 years consecutively with the ROC. LLP is supposed to file every year these 3 documents: statement of accounts, declaration of solvency and an annual return. But last 5 years consecutively, continuously, our LLP has not filed. So the tribunal will pass an order for winding up of this LLP. Then the fourth situation, the LLP acted against the sovereignty, integrity, and security of India. For example, the LLP was involved in some terrorism activity. Tribunal will pass an order to wind up the LLP because it has done something against India's security, sovereignty, and integrity. SSI. You should write all the 3 words in the examination: sovereignty, security, integrity. Okay. And then you have other just and equitable grounds. Basically, all other grounds, any other situation in which the tribunal might think that it is important to wind up the LLP. Apart from these 5 cases, there is one more case, the 6th case, if the LLP is unable to repay its debts. If LLP is unable to repay its debts, even in that case, tribunal will ask the LLP to get wound up. Simple question, guys. Can I proceed clear with this? Fine. Come to the third question. In the third question, let's see the first subdivision. What do you mean by partnership at will as per the Indian Partnership Act? Or comment on the right to expel partner must be exercised in good faith under the Indian Partnership Act. So in this third question, there are 2 options given. You can write any one out of these 2 questions for 2 marks. You can choose either question number 1 or you can choose question number 2, both about the Partnership Act and both very simple questions. Number 1, what do you mean by partnership at will? We all know about partnership at will. A partnership at will is one in which the duration of the partnership is not fixed. In a partnership at will, it will not be decided beforehand that when will this partnership come to an end. There will be no fixed duration for this partnership. In case any partner wants to dissolve the partnership, that partner will just have to give a written notice to all the other partners about his intention to dissolve the partnership, and the partnership will come to an end. Also, don't forget to write about the point that in case a partnership is created for a fixed duration, but partnership is continuing even after that fixed duration, then that partnership will get converted automatically into partnership at will. Did you understand what I just told you? Yes, it is a partnership for a fixed duration. For 6 months, we created the partnership. Because we decided the duration, it is obviously not partnership at will. Even after 6 months got over, we are still continuing the partnership. So in such cases, even though this was not a partnership at will, you will treat it as if it is a partnership at will. Okay, so this is about your first question. Then about your second question on the right to expel partner must be exercised in good faith. This particular question comes under one of the rights of a partner. One of the rights of partners is that they cannot be expelled unnecessarily. A partner can be expelled by majority. Majority of partners should be okay, and all the following conditions should be fulfilled. Number 1, partnership agreement should allow expulsion of partner. Number 2, you should be removing that partner in good faith. You should be removing that partner for the benefit of the firm as a whole. Basically, you should not be removing the partner just for personal benefit of some partners. If you're removing a partner, if you're expelling a partner, it should be in the best interest of the firm as a whole. Then you have to give a notice to the expelled partner. Give him an opportunity of being heard. This is nothing but the principle of natural justice. Whenever you want to take any action against a person, you yourself cannot decide. You will have to give that person also an opportunity of being heard. Write about that, and then make sure you write this, that in case any of these conditions are not fulfilled, then that expulsion will be null and void. Okay, so the expulsion will be valid only if all these 5 conditions are fulfilled. Number 1, it should be allowed by the agreement. Number 2, it should be in good faith. Number 3, it should be in the best interest of the entire firm. Number 4, you must give a notice to the expelled partner. What will you write in this notice? You will have to write in this notice that we are intending to expel you. and you have to give him an opportunity of being heard, nothing but an opportunity where he can justify himself, where he can plead the other partners that please don't expel me. If any of these conditions are not fulfilled, then I will say that the expulsion was null and void. Tell me guys, are we clear with the first subdivision of the third question? Both the questions clear for everybody? Yes. Suddenly I am seeing very less participation in the chat box. What is happening? Clear with both? Both very simple questions, very straightforward questions again. Okay, fine. Let's go to the second subdivision of the third question now. Again a partnership act question. What are the consequences of non-registration of partnership? What are the rights which won't be affected by non-registration of partnership firm? A 4-mark question. Entire 4 marks based on registration of partnership firm. We all know registration of partnership firm is not mandatory. It depends upon the partnership firm whether they want to get themselves registered or not. But the disabilities of non-registration are so severe that a partnership firm would obviously prefer getting itself registered. Okay, so what will be your answer to this question? First of all, what are the consequences of non-registration? 3 consequences. Number 1, the firm or its partners cannot file a case against third parties. Number 2, if an action is brought against the firm, set-off cannot be claimed. And number 3, the aggrieved partner cannot sue other partners or the firm. So this will be your answer to the first subdivision. That what will be the effects of non-registration? 3 effects. Number 1, the firm or its partners cannot file a case against third parties, but third parties can file a case against the firm. Number 2, in case any person files a case against the firm cannot claim set-off benefits, which means let's say a particular person, Mr. X, is suing the partnership firm. This particular person is suing the partnership firm because the firm is not repaying a loan which the firm had borrowed for rupees 10 lakhs. The firm is not repaying. So X is filing a case against the firm. At that time, the firm cannot say that X, even you owe me 6 lakh rupees. Even you have to pay me 6 lakh rupees. So set off this 6 lakhs with 10 lakhs which I owe you. Net, I owe you only 4 lakhs. This is set off, isn't it? Set off, firm is saying, I owe you 10 lakhs, you owe me 6 lakhs. So set off, net, I owe you only 4 lakhs. This set off benefit firm will not have. If the firm is not registered, the firm will not have this set off benefit. Okay. And then coming to the last disability of non-registration, the partner cannot sue other partners, cannot sue the firm. But the partners can sue other partners, can sue the firm in the event of dissolution, or if there is any dispute relating to the accounts or realization of his share in the firm's property upon dissolution. Basically, upon dissolution, even though it is an unregistered firm, the partners can sue each other and can sue the firm. If they did not get their share back properly, or if the accounts of the dissolved firm are not properly made, or any dispute relating to dissolution, they can file a case against each other. Okay, are we clear with this question, guys? Can I go to the next one? In this question, they had asked us 2 things. Number 1, what are the consequences of non-registration? That we've just seen. Totally 3 consequences. Consequence number 1, the firm and the partners cannot sue third parties, but third parties can sue them. Number 2, the firm cannot enjoy the set-off benefit. And number 3, the partners cannot sue other partners. The partners cannot sue the firm. When we learned, even if it is an unregistered firm, the partners can sue other partners. Partners can sue the firm in case the firm is getting dissolved any dispute relating to dissolution or accounts of dissolved firm, then you can sue. Okay. Then the next subdivision of this question was, what are the rights which will not get affected even though the firm is not registered? Even if the firm is not registered, third parties can still sue the firm. We already spoke about this. Even though the firm is unregistered, official assignee can get insolvent partner's property released. What does this mean? Do you all know about this point, or do you all want me to discuss it with you all? Listen to me. Let me quickly give you a summary of this point. Official assignee can get insolvent partner's property released. What does this mean? Very simple. See, listen to me. Let's say this particular firm has 3 partners, okay? A, B and C. And let's say this partner C has become insolvent. We all know what is the meaning of insolvency. Insolvent means his assets are insufficient to pay off all his liabilities. When one partner becomes insolvent, then the entire firm has to get dissolved. When one partner dies, entire firm has to dissolve. When one partner becomes insolvent, entire firm has to get dissolved. The story will be different in case the partners have decided in the agreement that this partnership firm will not get dissolved even if a partner dies or even if a partner becomes insolvent. If they decide like that in the agreement, then the firm won't get dissolved. But if the agreement is silent, then even one partner dies, even one partner becomes insolvent, the firm will dissolve. Okay. So let's say this particular person C has become an insolvent. When a person becomes insolvent, the court will appoint a person for this insolvent. The court will appoint a person for this insolvent, and that person will be called the official assignee. Okay. What this official assignee will do is that he will handle this insolvent's assets and liabilities. He will see what are all the assets this insolvent person has. He will take all those assets. He will sell them for the best price possible, get as much money as possible, and then he will pay off the liabilities of this insolvent person in the best manner possible. That is the work of your official assignee, to handle the assets and liabilities of this insolvent person. Okay, now listen to me. If you look at Mr. C, don't you think that he would have invested money into the partnership firm? So, he will be having a share in the firm's property. Do you agree with me? Mr. C is a partner of the firm. Mr. C has become insolvent. We are seeing what are all his assets now. Don't you think his share in the partnership firm also is his asset? Because he would have invested money here. So he will be having a share in the firm's assets. He will be having a share in the firm's property. Do you agree with me or not? He will be having a share in the firm's property. Yes, so this will become his asset. So, even if the firm is unregistered, this official assignee can come to that firm and ask the firm to give him this insolvent partner's share in the property. I'll repeat again in case you did not understand. This official assignee can come to the firm even if the firm is unregistered and can ask this firm to give to him to release the share of this insolvent partner in the firm's property. Why? Because this official assignee, that is his job. He will collect all the assets of this person, of this insolvent person. And this insolvent person's share in the firm's property also becomes his asset. So let's say there are totally 3 partners and let's say they are equal partners. So all of them have 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 share. And let's say this firm has 3 properties. So the official assignee will come to this firm and will ask for his share in the firm's property. So he will take one of the properties and he will go. Do we understand this now? All of us are clear? Official assignee can get the insolvent partner's property released. Ambadas and Adi Agarwal, are we both clear with this discussion? Okay. And then lastly, even if the firm is unregistered, set off benefit up to 100 rupees it can claim. We learned earlier that if the firm is unregistered, no set off benefit. But even if it is unregistered, up to 100 rupees set off is allowed. This will be the answer to your second subdivision of question number 3. Understood? So question number 3, subdivision 2 was all about non-registration. The first question here was about what will be the impact if firm is unregistered. 3 things we learned. Firm cannot sue third parties, firm cannot claim set-off benefit, and partners cannot sue each other. But what rights won't be affected even though the firm is unregistered? Number 1, set-off benefit they can claim up to 100 rupees. Number 2, other parties can sue the firm. And number 3, official assignee can get the insolvent partner's property seized. Okay, so I am hoping till here all of us have understood properly. Okay, fine. Come, let's go to the next subdivision, the last subdivision of the third question, entirely case study based. There are 3 questions over here, each question for 2 marks. Okay, totally 6 marks this question is carrying. Let's see the questions one by one. All the 3 case study based questions are about Contract Act and all the 3 simple case studies. Let's see the first one. Mr. S and Mr. R made a contract wherein Mr. S agreed to deliver paper cup manufacture machine to Mr. R and to receive payment on delivery. So S and R are having a contract. As per the contract, S will deliver a machine to R, and after the delivery happens, only then R will make payment to S. If I stop the question right here, can you tell me guys that according to you all, who must perform first? Should S perform first or should R perform first? Tell me. S should perform first or R should perform first? Obviously, Mr. S should perform first. Very clearly the question says that first S will deliver the machine, only then R will make the payment. So only if S is performing, only then R will perform. S has to deliver the machine first, only then R will make the payment. Okay. On the delivery date, Mr. R did not pay the agreed price. Decide whether Mr. S is bound to fulfill his promise at the time of delivery. So S is taking the machine to Mr. R, but R is refusing to make the payment. This question is all about reciprocal promises. Reciprocal promises means what? It means both the parties have promised something to each other that both of them will perform in the future. S has promised that he will deliver the machine in the future, and R has promised he will make the payment in the future. Okay, so both the parties have promised each other. This becomes a case of reciprocal promises. So even if one party is not willing to perform his promise, then the other party need not perform his promise also. It will become a breach of contract. S is taking the machine to R, but R is saying, sorry, I won't make the payment. So what can S do? S can simply say it is a breach of contract. He can say R has refused to perform and S need not give the machinery now. S will take the machinery and he will go back. If there is a breach of contract, if one party is not performing his obligation, then the other party, even he need not perform his obligation. Are we clear with the first question here? Come on, quickly tell me yes or no. First subdivision we all understood. Simple this is. If one party does not perform his promise, other party also need not perform his promise. Okay. Now let's come to the second subdivision. Mr. Y had given a loan to Mr. G, 30 lakh rupees. So Y had given a loan to G. Y is the money lender and G is the borrower. Mr. G defaulted the loan on due date and debt became time barred. Time barred, do we all know what is time barred debt? Yes, what is time barred debt? You will have to apply the law of limitation. As per the Limitation Act, if the lender of money is not demanding repayment for 3 years, then the debt becomes time barred. G has refused to make the payment. So Y should demand the money, right, from G. If Y is not demanding money from G, if 3 years lapse, then the debt will become time barred. If the debt becomes time barred, then what will happen is that G need not repay. A time barred debt need not be repaid. So 3 years have lapsed. Now G need not repay. After the time barred debt, still Mr. G is agreeing to settle the full amount to Mr. Y. Whether acceptance of time barred debt contract is enforceable in law. This particular question is relating to the concept of exceptions to no consideration, no contract. Generally, if there is no consideration, then there will be no contract. But there are some exceptional cases wherein even though the party is getting no consideration in return, still the contract is valid. In this case, between Y and G, debt has become time barred, which means G need not repay. Still, G is promising to repay the money to Y. Y is giving nothing in return to G. Still, this will be a valid contract. A promise to repay time barred debt, if it is in writing and if it is signed by the borrower, then it will be a valid contract. Even though there is no consideration, even though the borrower G is getting nothing in return for his promise to repay, still this will be a valid contract. Okay, so in the answer to this question, you will first have to write that it's a time barred debt as per law of limitation and hence it need not be repaid. Then you will also have to write, however, as per exceptions to no consideration, no contract, in this case, even though Mr. G is getting no consideration for repaying the time barred debt, still it will be a valid contract provided the promise is in writing and it is signed by the borrower. Are we clear with this question, guys? Shall I proceed to the next one? This was all about your time barred debt. The last point you mean written and signed? Yes? The last point, Jagtar, you're talking about written and signed? Okay, listen to me. Y and G, between them they have a loan. That loan has become time barred, which means 3 years have lapsed. Hence now G need not repay the money. The debt has become time barred, need not be repaid. Still, G is promising to repay. Is G getting anything in return from Y for this? No. There is no consideration. Generally, if there is no consideration, the contract becomes void. In this case, even though there is no consideration, the contract will still be valid. But two conditions. This promise which G is making to Y, this promise that he will repay the debt even though it is time barred, this promise should be in writing and this promise should be signed by G. Okay, only then this will be a valid contract. Fine. Now listen to the next question, the last subdivision of the third question. A and B entered into a contract to supply a unique item alternate of which is not available in the market. This one line is a game changer for this entire question. A unique item, alternate is not available. A refused to supply the agreed unique item to B. What directions could be given by the court for breach of such contract? You understood the story? A and B have a contract. As per the contract, A is going to supply some goods to B, and those goods are unique. You will not find an alternative for these goods in the market. But then A committed a breach. Breach means what? A refused to perform his promise. A refused to give these goods to B. So the question is asking you, what directions could be given by the court? For this breach, what directions will the court give to A? Or what order will the court pass because this breach has happened? Now this question is all about the remedies for breach. When there is a breach, what are the remedies? What are all the various kinds of orders which the court can pass? Number one, court can ask the person who has committed the breach to pay damages. Then the court can ask the person who has committed the breach to pay for whatever amount the other party has already performed. The court can order for cancellation of contract. And the last point is that the court can also order for specific performance. When does the court order for specific performance? If the goods are of unique nature and how much ever damages you ask Mr. A to pay B, that will not be enough because the same kind of goods B will not be able to find anywhere else. In such cases, the court can order specific performance. I'll repeat again. What did I just say? In case there is a breach of contract. And what kind of a contract is it? It is a contract wherein I'm talking about unique goods, special goods for which no alternative is possible. This kind of a contract has been breached. Okay. How much ever damages, fine, penalty you ask A to pay B, the damages will never be enough. Why? Because those goods were of unique nature. So how much ever money you pay to B, B will still not be able to find an alternative in the market. Isn't it? In such cases, when damages will be insufficient, when damages can never be enough, in such cases, the court will ask A for specific performance. Specific performance means what? Very simple. Court will ask A, you have to perform. You have to do what you promised you will do. You promised you will deliver those unique goods. Come on, deliver. This question is all about specific performance. You will have to write that the court can order for specific performance in such case. Why? Because the goods are unique in nature and damages will not be adequate. So in such cases, the court can give a direction for specific performance. Okay guys, so we are done discussing the first three questions. Can I go to the next one? Are we all clear till here? Any questions for anybody? No? Fine. Let's go to the fourth question. The fourth question is a pure theory question. Explain any 6 circumstances in detail in which non-owner can convey better title to bona fide purchaser of goods for value as per the Sale of Goods Act 1930. This question is a Sale of Goods Act question, a 6 marks question. What is this question all about? They're asking you 6 circumstances in which the non-owner can convey better title to bona fide purchaser. The general rule is that no one can give what he himself does not have. If I myself don't have proper ownership rights, if I myself don't have good title, I cannot give good title to the buyer. What is the Latin term for this? Nemo dat quod non habet. Nemo dat quod non habet. So if I myself don't have proper ownership rights, proper title, I cannot give proper title to the buyer. But then there are exceptions to nemo dat quod non habet. Those exceptions are what they are asking you all in this question. They're asking you what are those cases in which even a non-owner means what? A person who does not have proper title. Even though he is a non-owner, even though he does not have title, he is still able to give good title to the buyer. Exceptions to nemo dat quod non habet. This you would have studied under Sale of Goods Act. You understood the question? Generally, only if I have good title, I can give you good title. Nemo dat quod non habet. But there are exceptional cases in which even though I don't have good title, I am still able to give you good title. I am still able to give you ownership. Those situations they are asking you. Sale by mercantile agent, sale by joint owner who is having possession, sale by person in possession under voidable contract, sale by seller in possession, sale by buyer, it's not possession, it should be possession. Sale by seller in possession, sale by buyer in possession, sale by unpaid seller, sale by finder of lost goods. All these points you would have learned in your transfer of property chapter. Okay, I am not going into discussing the theory of all these points now. It's a basic theory question. I am hoping you are aware of the discussion. Sale by mercantile agent. I gave goods to the agent to sell on my behalf. He is selling at a price which is lesser than what I asked him to sell. Basically, he is selling without my authority. The buyer is buying in good faith, having no idea. The buyer will get good title. Similarly, sale by joint owner. The car is jointly owned by you and I. But you are only driving the car, you are only having possession of the car. So whole world thinks that the car is owned by just you. You go and sell off that car without even my permission. Sale by joint owner who is having possession. The buyer, if he is buying in good faith, having no idea that even I am the owner of the car, he will get good title. So all these points will come in your answer to this question. Exceptions to nemo dat quod non habet. If you want the answer of this in even more detail, please check one of the videos under Sale of Goods Act chapter in the LearnCap portal under the Transfer of Property chapter. Okay, under the Transfer of Property chapter, you will find a detailed discussion on all these cases in the LearnCap portal. You can go there and have a look. Okay, fine. Can I go to the next question? Can I go to 4B? Clear with 4A, everybody? Okay, now coming to 4B. Next question, a 6 marks question, again based on your Partnership Act. PQR and S are the partners in PQRS and Co. A partnership firm which deals in trading of washing machines of various brands. Due to conflict of views between partners, P and Q decided to leave the partnership firm and started competitive business on 31st July in the name of Messrs. PQ and Co. Meanwhile, R&S have continued using the property in the name of Messrs. PQRS and Co. in which P and Q also have a share. Based on the above facts, explain in detail the rights of outgoing partners as per the Indian Partnership Act and comment on the following. Rights of P and Q to start a competitive business. Rights of P and Q regarding their share in the property of Messrs. PQRS and Co. Now this question over here is one of the tricky questions of your November 2020 paper. This is one of the difficult questions in this paper a question which you will be able to answer only if your preparation was 100% and up to the mark. What is this question all about? Let us discuss about that first. In this question, there are totally 4 partners, P, Q, R and S, and all of them are running a partnership firm. Out of the 4 partners, P and Q decide to leave the partnership firm, and they started a new partnership firm called P, Q and Co. The remaining 2 partners, R and S, they are continuing the old partnership firm, P, Q, R, S and Co. They are continuing to do business under the old partnership firm. Now listen to me. It's very logical. P and Q have left the firm. They have left the old firm. So, shouldn't they get a share from this firm? They should get a share from the property in this firm, isn't it? Because they are leaving the firm. What happened was they left the firm without taking their share out of the firm, and R and S continued this firm PQRS with all the property, including the property which is P and Q's share. Okay, so they are asking us first P and Q's right to start a competitive business. When they left the firm, they started a new firm PQ and Co. doing competitive business. Is that allowed? What do you think? Look at the answer. An outgoing partner may carry on business competing with that of the firm and may advertise such business, but he cannot use the firm's name, cannot represent himself as carrying on business of the firm, cannot solicit the customer who were dealing with the firm before he ceased to be a partner. Did we understand these 3 points? What these 3 points mean is that P and Q, after they leave the firm, they can start a competing business. They can start a competing firm, but then that competing firm cannot use the same firm name. The old firm name is PQRS and Co. P and Q cannot use the old firm name, number 1. And they are not doing that also. What is the name that they are choosing? They are choosing the name PQN, which is not the same as PQRS and Co. So first condition fulfilled. Condition number 2, they cannot represent as if they are carrying on the business of the firm. P and Q cannot go around saying they are still doing business for PQRS and Co. They cannot represent this firm. They are not doing that also. And number 3, they cannot take away the customers of PQRS and Co. They cannot solicit the customers. They cannot take away the customers of PQRS and Co. They should build a new customer base. All these 3 conditions fulfilled, hence PQ and Co. can start a competing firm. You understood the story? They are leaving PQRS and they are starting a new firm, a competing firm. Is that okay? Yes, it is okay. You are allowed, outgoing partner, retiring partner, you are allowed to start a competing business, a competing firm, but don't use the same name of the old firm. Don't represent yourself as if you are still representing the old firm, and don't take away the customers of the old firm. If you fulfill all the 3 conditions, then it's okay. You can start a competing business, a competing firm. Okay, but this retiring partner, this outgoing partner cannot start a competing firm if there is an agreement between the partners that in case a partner leaves, he will not start a competing firm. If an agreement is there, then you cannot start a competing firm. That agreement should be reasonable. The restriction should be reasonable restriction. You cannot say never in your life you cannot start a competing firm. No. Next 2 years in the same area, you cannot start competing firm. Reasonable restriction, reasonable agreement allowed. Okay. So your answer to this question will be in 2 parts. Number 1, you will say that P and Q can start a competing business provided they don't use the name of the old firm, they don't represent themselves as if they are working for the old firm, and they don't take away the customers, they don't solicit the customers of the old firm. However, if there is an agreement between the partners as per which the outgoing partners cannot do competing business for a specified time limit for a specified area, then if the restriction is reasonable, then P and Q cannot start competing business. Tell me, subdivision 1, are we all clear? Did we understand? Yes? Are we all clear with subdivision 1? Can I proceed? Quick answers. Did we all understand? Yes? Fine. Now coming to the next subdivision. The next subdivision, this is the important one. This is the one which students might find a little difficult. Rights of P and Q regarding their share in property in PQRS and Co. See, if you remember what happened in this case, what did I tell you? I told you that P and Q, they left the firm. They left without taking their share in the firm. Without taking their share in the firm, they left. And this other two partners, R and S, they are continuing the firm, including the property of the outgoing partner. They have not given away their share yet. So in such cases, when a partner dies or when a partner leaves the firm, and if the partnership firm is still continuing without giving him his share, then two options are available. Whatever is the outgoing partner's share in the property, from that whatever profit the firm has earned, that profit has to be given to the partners even though they have left the firm. So share of the profits made attributable to the use of his property. Whatever is the property, his share of property in the firm, from that whatever profits the firm has made, they should give him a share of profits even though he has left the firm. Number 2, second option, whatever is his property in the firm, whatever is the value of his property in the firm, 6% per annum of that property should be given as interest to the outgoing partner. Okay, so what are the two options? In case a partner leaves the firm or dies and the remaining partners continue the firm even with the property of the old partner, they have not given away him his share in the property, then from his share in the property, whatever profit the firm has earned, that profit has to be given to this partner and interest at the rate of 6% per annum, or out of these two, any one option you can pick, either share of profits or interest. Okay, simple question. So the answer to this question should have both the options. The outgoing partner can choose any one of the two options. This is about question 4. Are we clear with the first 4 questions? Yes, I'm very sure the first 4 questions you have understood. The 4th question alone was a little tricky. It had about partners leaving the firm without taking away their property. Okay, fine. Now let's come to question number 5. Question number 5, the first subdivision, extremely simple. It's a Sale of Goods Act question for 6 marks. Mr. R owns a two-wheeler which she handed over to her friend Miss K on sale or return basis. So R has given her two-wheeler to K on sale or return basis. Even after a week, Miss K neither returned the vehicle nor made payment. She instead pledged the vehicle to Mr. A to obtain a loan. Miss R now wants to claim the two-wheeler. Will she succeed? Examine with reference to the provisions of Sale of Goods Act what recourse is available to Miss R. A very simple sale or return question. What will you write as answer to this question? Number 1, you will say that when goods are sold on sale or return basis, the property will pass on to the buyer if he informs about his approval or acceptance to the seller, or if he does any act indicating his acceptance. For example, he resells the goods or he pledges the goods, or if he retains the goods beyond fixed or reasonable time. You'll have to write about all the 3 points. Now in this case, K will become the owner of the two-wheeler either if Mr. K informs R that he is accepting the two-wheeler, or if Mr. K resells the two-wheeler, or if he pledges it and gets a loan against a two-wheeler, or he keeps the vehicle even after the specified time. In this case, Mr. K has pledged the vehicle to A. So his act of pledging the vehicle and borrowing a loan against that vehicle indicates that he has accepted the vehicle and he has become the owner. Hence, R will have no right. R cannot get the vehicle back from K. That will be your answer to the first subdivision, a basic sale or return question, that is. Second question, would your answer be different if it had been expressly provided that the vehicle would remain property of Miss R until the price has been paid? What is the second situation? In the second situation, they are saying that it is a case wherein sale for cash, wherein they are saying that R is telling K that listen, you will become the owner of the two-wheeler only when you make the payment. K has not made the payment. Instead, he has pledged the two-wheeler to A and borrowed a loan. That pledge will be invalid. Why? Because he does not even own the two-wheeler. Why doesn't he own the two-wheeler? Because it is sale for cash only, which means K will become the owner only when he makes the payment. If it has been expressly provided that the vehicle would remain the property of Miss R until price has been paid, then in that case, property will not pass to Miss K until cash is paid. So Miss R can claim back the vehicle from Mr. A in this situation. You got this story? Are we clear with this part of the discussion, everybody? I'll repeat this last part alone once again. If it is sale or return basis, then the asset, the property will pass on either if you convey that you are accepting it, you signify your acceptance, or you do something, for example, you resell the goods or you pledge the goods, or if you keep the goods even beyond a certain time. That is in sale or return. That is the first question. Second question is about sale for cash only. If it is very clearly mentioned that buyer, you will get the ownership only when you make the payment, then property will pass only when you make the payment. Because K has not made the payment yet, the two-wheeler is still R's property only. So even though K has pledged it to A, that pledge is invalid because K doesn't even own the two-wheeler. So R can get the two-wheeler back from A because K hasn't made the payment. So R only is the owner. So R can get his vehicle back from A. Okay. So this is about question 5, subdivision A. Now coming to question 5, subdivision B. This is the Companies Act question. Again, a pure theoretical, a pure descriptive question wherein they are asking you about Section 8 companies. A 6-mark question just about Section 8 company, a very simple question. They have asked you what are all the significant points of Section 8 company which are not applicable for other companies. Briefly explain with reference to provisions of Companies Act 2013. Basically, they are asking you what are the provisions which are specially applicable to Section 8 companies. A big question, 6 marks question this is. A lengthy answer you will have to write. Number 1, you will have to write what are Section 8 companies. Companies which have a charitable objective, which are engaged in promotion of art, science, culture, sports, education and all. Then you will write that in these companies, they need not have the word limited or private limited in their name. They require a license which is given by the central government, now delegated to ROC. Then you will write that these companies are prohibited from declaring dividend. They are prohibited from paying dividend to their shareholders. In case they make any profits, they should use that profit for the furtherance of their charitable objects. Then you will write that in case this company is winding up, if there is any surplus asset, that surplus asset cannot be distributed amongst shareholders. Surplus assets have to be contributed to another Section 8 company with similar objects. Then you will write that the provisions of Companies Act relating to minimum paid up capital, minimum directors, independent directors, dividend, nomination committees and all not applicable to Section 8 company. Then you will say that the license which the central government had given might be revoked by the central government, now delegated to regional director. It will be revoked in case this company is not following the terms and conditions subject to which this license was given, or if this company is conducting its affairs fraudulently, or if the company is violating its objects, it's not doing any charitable objects, or if the company does something which is against the interest of the public. And once the license is revoked, make sure you write on that once license is revoked, then the central government might either convert the Section 8 company into a public or private company, or this Section 8 company might be asked to wind up, or this Section 8 company may be merged, may be amalgamated with another Section 8 company. Basically, the entire concept of Section 8 company you will have to write down as your answer to this question. You get it? Your entire answer about Section 8 company will, entire discussion about Section 8 companies, what are they, what are the special features about dividend, distribution of surplus assets, then about license, all these points will come as your answer to this question. Clear with this one? Okay, fine. Now listen to the next discussion. Coming to question number 6, the last question of your part A. The first subdivision over here, again a pure theoretical question. Differences between wagers and contract of insurance. This is a 5 marks question, again about your Contract Act. The answer to this question is given in a study material, a straightforward question this is. There are totally 7 points. It's a 5 mark question. So even if you write 5 points, should be enough. Okay. What is an insurance contract? Somebody suffers a loss. To indemnify that loss, you have insurance contract. Wagering agreement, nothing but betting. Promise to pay something on the happening or non-happening of an event. Then write about how your contracts of insurance are valid contracts, but wagers are void and they are even illegal in the state of Maharashtra. Then how in contracts of insurance, there are two considerations. Both the parties are giving something to each other. But in wagering agreement, there is no consideration. If I win the bet, I win money. If I lose the bet, I have to give money. So all these points are anyways given to you in your study material. You can have a look. Simple, straightforward question this is. And then the next question, again a theoretical question. Explain in detail the circumstances which lead to liability of firm for misapplication by partners. It's a Partnership Act based question. They're asking you, when will the firm be liable for misapplication by partners? Which means partners have used the money of the firm for unauthorized purposes, but still firm only will be liable. Two situations there are in this answer, the answer to this question. Number 1, you will write that the partner is acting within authority. Acting within his apparent authority, received money and misapplies it. The third party, see, let me give you a situation to explain the answer to this question to you. Let's say the firm has lent money. The firm has given a loan to a third party. Okay. The firm has authorized one of the partners to receive the repayment of this loan. So the third party gave the repayment to this partner because firm authorized the partner to receive the repayment. Partner received the repayment and misapplied the money. Received the repayment and used the money for his own purposes. Can the firm blame the third party? Can the firm ask third party for payment again? No, right? So that is the first case, that the firm cannot ask third party for payment again because firm had authorized the partners and third party gave money to that partner. Partner has misapplied the money. Partner has misused the money. Firm cannot hold third party liable anymore. Story is over. Second case, the third party had repaid directly to the firm. Third party repaid directly to the firm. Firm in the course of its business receives money from third party and that money is misapplied by the partners. So the third party paid money to the firm, but the partner took that money and misapplied. In both the cases, you cannot hold your third party liable, right? You cannot hold your third party liable. The firm cannot ask for a repayment again from the third party. That is about the second subdivision. So, there are totally two situations. Situation number one, the firm had authorized the partner to receive money. The partner received money from the third party and misapplied that money, misused that money for his personal purposes. Firm cannot ask for money again from the third party. Second case, third party directly gave the money to the firm, but the partner took away that money and misapplied it. Again, firm cannot hold the third party liable more. Okay, this is the second subdivision of your sixth question. And now coming to the last subdivision of your sixth question, a very simple question. It's about foreign companies. Mike Limited, incorporated in India, having liaison office at Singapore. Explain in detail the meaning of foreign company and analysis on whether Mike Limited would be called as foreign company as it established a liaison office at Singapore as per the provisions of Companies Act. This company is incorporated in India and it has a liaison office, something like a branch office, has a branch office in Singapore. Is this company a foreign company? Of course not. Foreign company means number one, it should be incorporated outside India. But this company is incorporated in India. Foreign company means it should have a branch office in India. But this company is having branch office outside India. This company is definitely not a foreign company. Because foreign companies means it should be incorporated outside India. Okay. Amba Das, you're saying you've not understood the last question. Which last? Are you talking about this one? This foreign company one? Or are you talking about this liability of firm question? 6B or 6C? Will you answer? Let me finish off 6C. 6C, very simple. Foreign company means company should be incorporated outside India and should have a place of business in India. But Mike Limited is the opposite. It is incorporated in India and has a place of business outside India. So Mike Limited is not a foreign company. Okay, 6C we all understood. How will your answer be? You will write the meaning of foreign company first. Foreign company means company incorporated outside India, has a place of business in India and carries on business from this place of business in India. But because Mike Limited company is incorporated in India, it is not a foreign company. Simple answer. Maximum 4 or 5 lines, your answer will get over for this. Now coming back to 6B. One of the students was not clear with this. It's a very simple question. Here they are asking us, explain the circumstances which lead to liability of firm for misapplication by partners. I agree with you that this question is not very clear. Okay, but what the question is trying to tell you is that the question wants to know from you what are the situations in which the partner has misapplied the money. Partner has misapplied the money, but still firm cannot ask money from the third party. Okay, what is the question about? The question is all about cases wherein my partners have misused the firm's money, but still the firm cannot ask third party for again repayment. Two situations. Situation number one, partner was authorized by the firm. The firm gave authority to the partner to receive repayment from third party. The third party gave repayment to this partner. Now what should the partner do with this money? Partner should give this money to the firm, but the partner did not do that. Instead, the partner misused that money for his personal purposes. That is one situation. In this situation, can the firm go to the third party again and ask for payment? Of course not, right? So this is the first case. Second case, the third party gave repayment directly to the firm. Okay, but the partner took that money and started misapplying it, started misusing it. Again, in this case, the firm cannot ask the third party for repayment again. So in such cases, the firm is liable to make good the loss. The firm will have to bear the loss. The firm cannot go to the third party and ask for payment again. Ambadas, now are we clear with this? Yes. With this, we are done discussing the entire question paper of your second paper, Business Laws Part A. All the 6 questions we have discussed. Now I'll open the floor for questions. Any questions? Please get them clarified.
Let's read the question. Still not started studying for laws. It follows the old rule of 370, and I find it challenging to learn from old videos to the new one. What should I do? Diya, there aren't major changes between the old and the new. I mean, this 370 would be the only major change, I think. Apart from that, there aren't any major amendments. You understand? There aren't huge amendments between the old videos and the present syllabus. So you can very well go ahead with the videos which are available in the portal. The 370 section, the article 370 which you're talking about, is a very small amendment. It's a very small change which shouldn't hamper your preparation. Okay, probably what we'll do is that maybe we'll put up one more video wherein we'll put up the changes which are there between the old videos and the present syllabus. So that might help you cope up, maybe. But I think this is more of an excuse because there aren't major changes between the old videos and the present syllabus. Okay. Article 370 also nothing major. Article 370 has been scrapped. That's all. Which means earlier the acts were not applicable to Jammu and Kashmir, but now those acts will apply to Jammu and Kashmir also. All your acts, all the 5 acts in your syllabus, Article 370 not applicable. Hence, all the 5 acts will also apply to Jammu and Kashmir. That's all. Okay. Companies Act, Jammu and Kashmir is included. Now, no more special status for Jammu and Kashmir. So, just like how any act will apply to any part of the country, it will also apply to Jammu and Kashmir. So, all your chapters, all your laws will also apply to Jammu and Kashmir. Okay. Can you write that Jammu and Kashmir is included in exam? See, in the exam, you won't even talk specially about Jammu and Kashmir. In case a question comes up, what you will say is that as Article 370 is scrapped, just like how a law will apply to the rest of the country, it will also apply to Jammu and Kashmir. Hence, your Indian Contract Act, your Sale of Goods Act, your Partnership Act, your Companies Act, your LLP Act are applicable to the whole of India, including the state of Jammu and Kashmir. You understood, Yashi? That's how your answer will be. You will simply write that the act is applicable to the whole of India, including Jammu and Kashmir, because Jammu and Kashmir does not enjoy a special status. Thank you guys. It was a pleasure. I'm very sure you would have learned quite a lot out of this session. All right. So I'll close over here. Thank you guys.
Subscribe to LearnCap and hit the bell icon to get notified.